victims of oppression.
So who are the victims of all of this? I think we know. First and foremost, precisely because of its importance and centrality, is the trade union movement. It's getting the sharp edge of the stick. And it's not by coincidence that one of the first things that Harper did when he got his majority last year was to attack the postal workers, and then to go after the Air Canada workers, and the CPR workers, et cetera, the wheat board workers, et cetera, right? They've now introduced new legislation, Bill C-377, put more and more of a squeeze on unions. Here in Ontario, you have Bill 115, and we have an official opposition who wants to, Hudak and company, right? Who want to bring in right to work legislation like they have in the US. They want to destroy the trade union movement because they know the trade union movement, because of its capacities, its resources, because it can stop work, is potentially their biggest threat. So they want to break the back of the trade union movement. But of course, it's not just organized labor that's under attack. It's Aboriginal peoples. It's new immigrant communities.
Women.
Refugees, and so on and so forth, right?
Women.
Women, seniors, farmers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And not least youth and students. But it's not just sectors or constituents. It's also such fundamental things as democratic rights. Democracy itself is a victim of this onslaught. Yes? And because time is running out, we get into the discussion. I could give you countless examples of this offensive. One of the most, least publicized was a recent bill passed in Parliament, private member's bill, introduced by the Tories, but supported by all the Tories and one Liberal, to basically gut the hate speech legislation, which helps the fascist organizations and racist organizations. I mean, it's a body blow against civil liberties in this country. Just one example, and there's, of course, countless others. The environment is a victim of this. And here again, I think it's obvious to everybody in this room what we mean by this. But this drive to suck out resources at any cost and to prevent any obstacle to that massive plunder of the natural wealth of our planet, right, is coming under attack. Environmental assessment review panels, all these kinds of things, and organizations who are being spied upon and harassed and so on and so forth. And not least, of course, peace is a victim of this. Not just because the defense industry happens to be one of the most profitable areas to accumulate capital. It's not, that's all true. Trillions upon trillions of dollars is wasted in the arms race, and people are getting rich off of it. But it's not just a question of transferring wealth to the rich through defense spending. It's because this system is inherently predatory and violent. And it's precisely during periods of crisis that character, that predatory, aggressive character of capitalism becomes most inflamed. When there's a scramble for resources, when there's a scramble for markets, and when there's increasing competition, and when some countries, like some of these BRICS, new powers are getting stronger. China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and the other imperialist centers feel more threatened by them, especially US imperialism, that there is an increasing danger of war, and of course we've seen all of the impact of that. Who's leading the charge? Is it Harper? No. No. It is monopoly capital, finance capital. That's who's calling the shots here. But one of the main reasons why, in the last election in 2011, why there was near unanimity amongst the ruling class in support of Harper and the Tories was precisely because they knew that they were the most reliable party to carry out that vicious austerity program on their behalf. So yes, in a sense, it is Harper and the Conservatives, but we should have no illusions. And we need to explain this to other workers who think it's just a question of Harper Or it's just a question of Mike Harris before. Got rid of Harris, everything would be better. We get rid of Harper, beautiful, clear skies. No, we need to explain to others what is the driving force behind this assault. And then, of course, there's provincial and municipal governments. We have one right here in Toronto, everybody knows about. Here we need to talk a little bit about the role of the NDP, and I'll be very brief on this point. Why? Because there's not much that can be done in Parliament right now. The Tories do have a majority. But we have to say, in all honesty, that Thomas Mulcair and the NDP aren't putting up very much of a principled fight. And why is that?
Because of their principles.
Part of it has to do with the fact that there is a certain opportunism, thinking that somehow if we just be non-controversial, right? If we keep a low profile and people get sick of Harper, we can kind of slip in 2015.
Electoral politics.
Narrow electoralism, cretinism, really. Get in through, by default. And that's a losing strategy. But more than that is the fact, and this is reflected again in social democratic parties right around the world. I mean, look at Greece. Look at the socialists in Greece. Or look at the
Socialists in France.
Look at Blair and New Labour, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that social democracy are certainly prominent, dominant sections of social democratic parties internationally have basically accepted most of the tenets of neoliberalism, of the preeminence of the market, and so on and so forth. They bought into it. And so their challenge is on the process. There should be more consultation. I mean, I don't mean to minimize. These are important questions too, don't get me wrong. But on the substance of the matter, their programs aren't that much different from the bourgeois parties. And that's certainly impacted. But despite all of that, there is a fight back that's growing. And it's growing in Europe. And it's growing in the Middle East, with obviously contradictions. Because there's also an attempt by imperialism to use the righteous indignation of the masses of the people to turn things in a reactionary direction. But it's in Latin America. We see, a number of anti-imperialist governments and progressive and, democratic governments come to power in Latin America, and in North America, and here in Canada. We didn't say too much about Occupy, but, it's in many respects it started with Occupy. Obviously, the Quebec student struggle this past year, and of course the Idle No More protests, tremendous. And what are some of the lessons that can be gleaned from that? Johan referred to some of them, and I just want to identify a few. Number one, the vital importance of unity. It's not by accident, again, that every time a real concerted struggle arises, there's an immediate attempt by the bourgeois press, by governments, by big business, to find ways of splitting the unity. They did it in Quebec with the students. They're trying to do it now with the Idle No More movement. They did it against Occupy, remember? You remember back to Occupy. Those tents are an eyesore. They're bad for business. People can't walk their dogs in the park. I mean, all sorts of things. Anyway, but all these efforts to negate these movements, to discredit them, and to divide them. So the question of the struggle of unity is absolutely vital. And we should never lose sight of it. And even though we're obviously critical about some of the weaknesses, obstacles that stand in the way, we should never lose sight that we have to build that unity, because without that, we don't stand a chance. It's the only thing that the masses of the people, that the working class itself has, is its numbers. And if we're divided, we're doomed. Second lesson is the importance of mass participation. Not just consultation, but real involvement, real sense of ownership. That was one of the most important things of the Quebec student struggle. How they kept going in the face of all of this was the fact that they had general assemblies and the students really felt involved. It wasn't just something coming from, some top federation. Not that it's not important to try to get the CLC to give leadership, or other senior bodies to play, to give real leadership. But there has to be also that kind of involvement at a mass level. Because ultimately, Without that, we're not going to be able to defeat this offensive, much less win socialism. There has to be the mass character. And thirdly, there has to be program. There has to be an alternative. It's not good enough to say no to war, no to austerity, no to Harper, and just try to hold on to the status quo, which keeps getting whittled down and whittled down and whittled down. Who was that famous Canadian folk singer? Bruce Cockburn, who had a song, "The trouble with normal is it always gets worse." Remember that line? Right? And the normal today is a lot worse than the normal was even 20 years ago. Yeah? So holding the line, as important as it is to hold the line, is not sufficient. And it could be argued that even having an anti-capitalist perspective is not sufficient. Because it means lots of things to lots of different people. I hate this aspect of capitalism, I hate that aspect of capitalism. What's good about it is that it's a systemic criticism of the system, not just this government or that policy, but this bill in Parliament. But being opposed to capitalism is not enough either. We need to win people for a socialist alternative, for socialism. And that's the other thing that our party is trying to bring to this mobilization to build the anti-austerity fight. And I got 1 minute left, so I better end very quickly. We have in this brochure that you will be seeing very soon a number of points for a people's recovery. I don't want to go through them all now. One of the cornerstones has to do with resources and energy and gaining it, really making that people's property and using all of the wealth of our country for the people, not for monopoly. Imagine the kinds of investments, programs, and services we could build if that was the case. Obviously for people's incomes, raising the minimum wage, etc. There's a whole bunch of proposals in here. And we call it a people's recovery, a program for people's recovery. And I have to admit, there's problems with the slogan, people's recovery. I think it's a very good propagandistic slogan, but it's not the best scientific slogan. Why? Well, we mean a people's recovery as opposed to the kind of recovery that the ruling class is imposing. They want a recovery where we all get poorer and profits recover. So we want to differentiate our perspective from that of monopoly. From that point of view, it's absolutely spot on, the slogan. It's like the slogan 99% and 1%. Not exactly scientific, but boy, it really resonates, doesn't it? It resonates. On the other hand, we know that there cannot be any sustained, real, genuine recovery, long-term recovery for the masses of the people, so long as this crisis of capitalism, which is not just cyclical, but structural, is not resolved. So in that sense, we're not talking about a recovery for capitalism. We're talking about a recovery that moves in the direction of overcoming capitalism, of winning socialism, of winning real progress. That's what we're going to be advocating, and that doesn't mean that we don't think elections are important. There will be a federal election in 2015. By all means, we need to fight there as well. But we have to help others to understand that we can't just hope for some sort of electoral rescue. And the lesson, again, from Quebec is incisive. Because there were those in Quebec as well who said, we want to get rid of Charest liberals as well. But if we protest, if we go on this strike, if we have demonstrations, if we shut down the port of Montreal, et cetera, then that will help Charest and the liberals, and we'll have them for another 4 or 5 years. Fortunately, that argument didn't carry. And in fact, I would argue, and our party would argue, that it was precisely the fact that the students fought in a mass way, day after day, on the streets, that created the conditions for the defeat of the Shah-Ray liberals. So if we want to defeat Harper and his agenda and the Tories and move politics to the left in this country, the way forward is not through passivity, ducking for cover, looking for refuge in a storm, but rather mobilizing on the scale that can really not only win immediate victories, but raise the people's consciousness for real, much more fundamental, transformative change. Thank you.
Sure.